Why part of New York's Appalachian Trail route was changed. Written by NewAgeSolution. The following is from an old notebook found in an abandoned home in Cook County, Texas. In 2003, I embarked on a backpacking trip with my lifelong friends Marcus and his girlfriend Trish. We were doing this to celebrate Marcus's return from rehab. We lived in North Carolina at the time and decided to hike the Appalachian Trail from central Virginia to New Hampshire. The first few weeks passed without incident, but the Pennsylvania and Virginia sections of the AT, as the Appalachian Trail is popularly referred, were hilly, treacherous, and impeded our progress. We were about 4 or 5 weeks into our trip when we reached New York. According to our map, the AT would immediately turn north by northwest towards Cascade Lake as it entered New York from New Jersey, before arcing back down and resuming its trek northeast parallel to Greenwood Lake's north shore. We crossed into New York relatively late in the day and set up camp at what our maps called the North Greenwood Shelter. It was about 2 or 3 miles south of Cascade Lake and marked where the AT veered back south towards Greenwood Lake. Since we had the shelter to ourselves, we saw no reason to pitch our tents. We made a fire, cooked dinner, and spent most of our time gathering wood and taking inventory of our supplies. There was also a nearby creek where we were able to replenish our water supply. It was around 11 o'clock and we were still wide awake, despite hiking well over 10 miles that day. The fire was dying and Marcus volunteered to gather more wood. I watched Marcus enter the wall of darkness that marked off where the campfire's light reached. Trish and I sat there and listened to Marcus's feet crush the foliage and twigs littering the ground as he walked deeper into the forest. Using the beam of light from his headlamp as a reference to determine an appropriate distance before we started talking, I finally asked Trish, "So, how's he been doing?" "Oh, he's getting on," Trish said after a brief pause. "You're never really cured. You just have to learn to live without drugs, one day at a time. But I think it's working for him. He really wants to prove himself," she said. Nodding, I stared at the fire and flicked a twig into the flames. Is he ready to talk about that night yet?" I asked carefully. While watching the fire, I felt Trish's eyes rest upon me. "Dirk, he was only back for a month before our trip. But to answer your question, I don't think he's come to terms with what happened yet." "Well, isn't that something that they'd work with him on?" I asked. Both of us jumped upon hearing the high-pitched sound of a stick snapping, despite quickly realizing that it was just Marcus collecting wood. Turning, I spotted the beam from Marcus's headlamp dancing in the rows of trees. Trish and I shared a light giggle before she replied, "He went to rehab, Dirk. They're just responsible for helping you overcome your addiction. But I do believe he's working with a therapist on gaining closure. But it'll take time," she said. I pursed my lips before continuing to speak. "I still can't believe they proved he got something slipped into his drink," I said, slowly shaking my head. "But that doesn't change the fact that he wrecked out and almost killed a woman." Another loud snap shattered the silence. A few moments later, Marcus returned with a bundle of sticks that he dropped alongside the fire circle's stone borders. "I'm going to go get one more bundle, then we should be good for the rest of the night," Marcus said with a stony, expressionless look that we had grown accustomed to seeing. Marcus didn't even wait for a reply from either of us as he quickly turned and re-entered the forest. I looked at Trish, who was frowning as she watched Marcus's headlamp light sway and shift sporadically beyond the tree line. "He's different now," Trish said quietly, almost like admitting such a thing brought her shame. "Well, going through what he did would change anyone," I replied. "Regardless of the circumstances, he probably still feels guilty, especially since he was already using pretty heavily before the incident. But who's to say he won't return to his old self in due time? He's been on that stuff for so long, I don't even think he remembers what his old self was like," she said. We sat in silence for a few seconds as I comprehended the magnitude of Trish's response. She then turned and started leaning in closer, like she was about to kiss me. "Between us, I'm pretty sure I know who spiked his drink that night," she whispered just as I started to uncomfortably back away. Before I could respond, we heard a loud, hard thump come from the forest that made us almost jump out of our skin. We both shot up to our feet and faced in the direction that the sound had come from, which was exactly where Marcus had gone. We could no longer see his headlamp as we tried making out any movement within the darkness. After about 10 seconds of eerie silence, I called out to Marcus, but I received no response. Trish whispered that she would get a flashlight and hurried over to her pack. Another loud snap rang out that caused both of us to freeze. A wave of dread swept over me as I replayed that noise in my head. It sounded noticeably different. This particular snap emitted a squishier, crumply, popping type sound, unlike the snapping of a dry stick or tree limb. I opened my mouth and was about to call out when the exact same noise blared from the darkness a second time. This time it seemed louder, harsher, and was accompanied by a loud, grumbling grunt from Marcus. "Marcus, you okay, bro?" I quickly called out with a strong sense of concern in my voice. I was becoming increasingly uneasy. I slowly stepped forward, but I stopped when Trish ran up alongside me with the flashlight. Turning it on, she started shining the beam into the seemingly endless rows of trees, but we saw nothing. I called his name again, this time in a firmer, more authoritative voice, indicating that this wasn't funny if Marcus was playing a joke. I was about to approach the tree line, but Trish grabbed my wrist and violently yanked me back, begging me not to venture any further. "Something's not right about this," Trish whispered anxiously, her grip tightening on my wrist. I saw the pure, unfettered fear in Trish's eyes. I wish I could have found the right words to put her at ease, but I was soon overcome with the same brand of apprehension. Given Marcus's rigid demeanor this entire trip, it felt unlikely that he would spontaneously humor himself at our expense, at least not in this manner. Especially considering how situations such as this easily triggered Trish's anxiety. We started hearing a series of rhythmic thumps and crunches, like feet stomping on the forest ground. They were accompanied by a crunchy squishing that slowly grew louder. Trish's breathing grew faster, and she began wildly shining the flashlight into the trees, looking for any sign of movement. Her panic state appeared to prevent her from precisely pinpointing the sound's source. As the slow thumping footsteps grew louder, I noticed something big lazily moving through the forest in our direction. I snatched the flashlight from Trish's hand to shine the beam towards the slowly advancing figure. My blood ran cold, and Trish released a horrifying, blood-curdling scream when the flashlight's beam rested upon the shape. I could only describe what I saw as a cross between an actual person and a monstrous creature. It was at least 6.5 feet tall, with pale, grayish-beige skin and a chunky, distorted torso that possessed somewhat of a vague S shape. Its small, bowling ball-sized head was tightly bound in bandages, and it had 2 large, inky black stains where its eyes should be. What I remember most was its brawny, swollen arms whose fingertips stretched down to its ankles. It wore a sleeveless, tattered, dark gray shirt and brown pants that were torn just below its knees. It had unnaturally large bare feet that must have been twice the size of a normal person's. As it drew closer, I noticed that its body was entwined in chains, along with metal and barbed wiring. Most disturbing of all, there were dozens of metal hooks, spikes, and other sharp, pointed objects piercing and protruding from its skin. Trish started frantically pulling me, screaming that we had to run. I was so awestruck that my legs wouldn't budge. My eyes remained fixed on the incoming being. But when I realized what it was holding, I finally snapped out of my shock-induced trance. At first, I thought that the creature clenched the tip of a meaty, dark pink tube or cable. My stomach sank when I realized that the creature was using it to drag something. Actually, someone. Marcus. There were no signs of life in Marcus's mangled, bloody body, which was folded backwards like a piece of paper. His face was misshapen and bludgeoned beyond recognition, and the cable that was being used to drag Marcus was coming from a gaping hole in his abdomen. This thing was dragging Marcus by his own intestine. "We need to go," Trish screamed as she smacked the side of my face, kicking in my fight-or-flight instinct. I heard the thing's loud, rhythmic feet thumping as it started pursuing us almost immediately after Trish and I fled. Succumbing to our panic, we wound up veering off the trail and sprinted into the woods. The thing kept up with us, and despite being significantly darker beneath the forest canopy, Trish and I managed to stay close. I quickly realized we inadvertently had run in the same direction as the creek, and upon reaching the creek bed, we abruptly stopped because the thing's loud thumping steps had ceased. When we turned and stared wildly, shining the flashlight behind us, we couldn't see it any longer. At that very moment, the only sounds that we heard were the babbling creek and our deep gasp for air as we desperately tried catching our breath. Although that thing was out of sight, we knew that we couldn't stop. It had to be watching us from the darkness, anticipating its next move. "We'll follow the creek downstream. I think I remember seeing on the map that it intersects with another trail that eventually leads to a road," I said in a hushed voice, while firmly pulling on Trish's shoulder. "Marcus," Trish said mournfully between sobs as she collapsed on the ground. She appeared to be on the verge of breaking into hysterics. "What was that thing?" she said. While remaining vigilant, I helped Trish up and held her tightly, in a vain attempt to console her. "We can't dwell on any of that right now, Trish. We need to go before it comes back," I said, keeping my arm wrapped tightly around Trish's shoulders. I slowly started navigating us down the creek bed. "It has to be nearby. It definitely hears us, so we can't stop moving," I said. Despite the rocky, uneven terrain, we hurried down the creek bed until the water pooled and it looked too deep for us to walk through. I trotted up a small but steep incline that brought me to level ground, and then I turned to help Trish climb up as soon as I had steadied myself. I extended my hand to Trish, but as soon as she grabbed it, a loud, crunchy crackling, like two hard surfaces striking against each other, rang out within inches of my ears. I felt Trish's grip lighten, while the large shoebox-sized stone that struck her rolled down the slope and settled right next to her feet. I screamed out Trish's name as I looked back up the creek bed to see that thing standing about 10 yards away, watching us. It threw the stone with all of its might and hit Trish directly in the head at the opportune time when we weren't looking. "Come on, Trish, stay with me. Hold on to me," I shouted frantically as I clenched Trish's forearm. I tried dragging her limp body up and over the slope. The entire right side of her face was coated in blood that flowed freely from the massive opening in her head. Trish, whose consciousness was fading, could only mumble garbled, breathy utterances that I couldn't even decipher while I overly focused on dragging her up the incline. She could barely budge at first and must have gotten caught under a rock or a tree root, prompting me to quickly readjust her posture. I was so focused on pulling Trish up that I didn't notice that the thing started closing in. Its footsteps were masked by the babbling creek. I had Trish pulled halfway up when I noticed the thing in the corner of my eye. It was clenching what resembled a cell phone-sized metal spike in its hand. The thing thrust it into the back of Trish's thigh and sliced down her leg in a single motion. The sounds of tearing flesh filled my ears as Trish sprang to life, emitting another agonizing, nightmarish scream. Clenching tighter to Trish's arm, I frantically urged her to fight and stay with me as I tried dragging the rest of her over the slope with all of my might. The thing clamped down on Trish's leg with its hands and engaged in a literal tug-of-war over Trish's body. Her constant, excruciating screams and shrieks grew progressively louder, while I desperately tried pulling her away, until I heard a squishy popping sound, during which I felt the resistance from the thing's pulling instantly fade and I fell back hard. I was about to help Trish, but was frozen with sheer numbing terror. She barely made any movements, and her screams were reduced to weak, croaky grunts as my eyes ran down her body, settling upon a bloody stump where her right leg should have been. That thing tore off her leg like a twig, a grim realization that I processed while it ascended the slope and stood over us. As the thing towered over Trish, I instinctively grabbed her arm and tried dragging her, knowing that I was already too late. All that I could do was helplessly utter her name in a weak, breathy gasp and watch the morbid being grab and pull another spike out from one of its swollen forearms. Without hesitation, the thing pressed one of its oversized feet on the bottom of Trish's back, snapping her spine as indicated by the muffled crack, and it plunged the spike into the back of her head. I heard Trish's last breath as the spike's tip burst through her neck directly under her chin. I sprinted away as fast as I could. Within seconds, I heard the thing's pounding footsteps close behind me. All the while, I was desperately trying to run faster than my body was capable of. My heart felt like it was about to burst from my chest, and I was convinced that my legs would eventually give out and that I would be this thing's next victim. Succumbing to despair, I started slowing down to accept my fate, when a blinding red light and high-pitched beep emitted from a nearby tree. The piercing noises filled my ears and distorted my vision, causing me to lose my footing. All that I remember was being slightly airborne for a fraction of a second and hitting the ground head first before everything went black. When I regained consciousness, it was daytime and I was back at the shelter, sprawled out in the lean-to. I felt a gauze pad on my aching forehead and I noticed a number of uniformed officers roaming about the vicinity. I spotted park rangers, local police officers, and state troopers, even a few individuals from three-letter agencies. Nobody noticed that I was awake, and my attention was drawn to a trio of people dressed in suits quietly conversing near the lean-to. "We can't take the perimeter for granted anymore," I heard one of them say. "We need to go in a new direction. 2 killed, but 1 survived, and that's too many," said another, although I was unsure if he was referring to me or my deceased friends. I spent the rest of the day in a daze. I remember being taken into a small helicopter that unexpectedly transported me to a police station. I was brought into a room and greeted by 2 men in suits who said that they were investigating the incident that had occurred. They didn't ask me any questions whatsoever, and they made me sign a series of documents before allowing me to get medical attention. I learned that these were gag orders, which forbade me from discussing any details of the events that took place that night. When I asked why this was necessary, they said that the investigation was ongoing, and they didn't want to cause any hysteria. I would have made more inquiries, but I wanted to leave so badly. I went through the motions without much objection. Before I left, the 2 men emphasized how important it was to keep quiet and threatened me with severe legal and personal consequences if I said anything to anybody. While recovering in the hospital, I read a local newspaper that featured the story about me and my friends. To my dismay, the article stated that 2 hikers were killed and 1 was injured in a vicious animal attack that was likely committed by a bear. It also mentioned that the stretch of the Appalachian Trail where it occurred and the surrounding area were indefinitely closed off to the public. One day later, I was visited by the same 2 men that had spoken with me at the police station. They made me sign an official police statement of my account from that night, which corroborated the bear attack story. Before leaving, they clarified that this was the story that I would go with and reiterated that there would be severe consequences if I ever contradicted this account. I returned home paranoid, confused, and overwhelmingly depressed over losing 2 of my closest friends in such a gruesome incident that I couldn't even openly discuss. I recall seeing those 2 exact same men randomly over the next couple of months. The sightings stopped after 2 or 3 months, and I eventually convinced myself that what happened that night was indeed a bear attack. It was about 18 months after the incident, and I had relocated to Texas. I was returning home one evening when I noticed a man in his early to mid-60s sitting on my front porch. When our eyes met, he stood up and hurriedly walked towards me, looking like he was anxious to tell me something. "I won't tell you my name, but I recently retired from the New York Department of Conservation," the man said as he retrieved a manila envelope from his pack and handed it to me. "All that I can tell you is I was there that day. I was with the DEC for over 30 years, and you weren't the first. I still don't know what's in those woods or why it's there, but you deserve to know more. Just promise to destroy what's in this envelope after you read it." The man walked past me, got into a car, and sped off before I could even respond. The envelope contained some extremely unnerving content. There was a map of the Appalachian Trail along the New York-New Jersey border that had 6 dots clustered around the North Greenwood shelter. Each one had a different year written above it: 1975, 1981, 1990, 1996, and 2001, twice for that last one. There were also 6 newspaper clippings that corresponded to each of the 6 red dots. Each revealed a slew of gruesome deaths that occurred along this particular stretch of the AT over those years. In 1975, a woman's dismembered body was found about 1.5 miles southwest from the shelter. In 1981, 2 newlyweds that set up camp at the shelter were savagely mauled to death in their tent by an unknown animal. In 1990, another couple camping at the shelter were bound and tortured by an unknown assailant. One died, but the second managed to escape. 6 years later, the dissected remains of 2 women were discovered 2 miles east of the shelter. In May 2001, another hiker was found cut in half about 1 mile west of the shelter. 3 months later, another man's mutilated body was found along the south shores of Cascade Lake, which was about 2 to 3 miles north of the shelter. Most of the deaths were ruled to be bear or animal attacks. Only the 1981 and the second 2001 deaths were declared murders. A small section of forested area on the map, about 1.5 to 2 miles west-northwest of the North Greenwood shelter, was highlighted in orange and had the word mines written in black ink. This, along with the 6 red dots, were surrounded by an imperfect circle of black X's, a few of which I noticed were along the creek near the shelter. The last piece of content inside the envelope was an updated map of the Appalachian Trail's New York/New Jersey region, the one that was released in 2004. I immediately realized that the trail no longer arched up towards Cascade Lake anymore. It now ran completely parallel along Greenwood Lake's northern shore upon entering New York. The North Greenwood shelter no longer appeared on the map. All that I can deduce from this information is that the original stretch of the AT, when first going into New York, was changed, seemingly right after the grizzly incident that I barely survived in 2003. I did some additional research and found a press release from the DEC informing of the route change, but it cited hazardous conditions and aggressive bear activity as the reason. I also discovered that the 1981 and 2001 murders featured in the clippings remained unsolved. I don't know what's lurking in those woods along the New York and New Jersey border, just north of the Appalachian Trail. There haven't been any reported incidents that have been made by the public from that region since. But as time passes, I'm feeling more compelled to return and find out for myself.